Hitman 2-3, this is Hitman 2. What's the status? Over. 2-3, stand by. Goliath, this is 2 Bravo. Request permission to engage enemy paratroopers and attempt to snatch a grid Papa uniform 259er, 119er. Break. Enemy is unaware of our presence at this time. Over. Solid copy. Hitman 2-3, Echo 5 Foxtrot. This is Hitman 2.
Good morning, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest today is Mr. Jeffrey Hunt. He's the author of the book Meade and Lee After Gettysburg, which is let's see if I can get that in the shot without a glare on it. It's an amazing book because it deals with what happened after 3 July. You watch a movie like Gettysburg, you read Killer Angels, there's a big dramatic, culmination on Cemetery Ridge, and then everybody goes home. Well, there's a lot more after that, and Jeffrey wrote a book about that. So Mr. Hunt, thank you for joining us today, sir.
Happy to be here.
Okay, so as I kind of gave in the setup here, we've got 3 July, Pickets Charge, the Pickett Charge for the hardcore enthusiasts has been repulsed. The question is, okay, what are the commanders going to do next? We know that eventually the Army of Northern Virginia retreats, but can you kind of set up for us, what happens from that point, and then we can segue into the maneuver that takes place after the culmination of the battle.
So obviously the Confederate attack on July 3rd is repulsed, but Meade decides not to launch a counterattack. The two armies remain in place on July 4th. It begins to rain. Lee's holding his ground as he had after the Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg, if you prefer, to kind of prove that he wasn't being driven from the ground, but also to give the enormous trains that he has of wounded and all the supplies that have been captured in Maryland and Pennsylvania, the 4,500 prisoners he has, to give those a chance to get on the road, and to head south, so that when he begins to pull back his combat arms, there is no obstruction on the road. And so Lee retreats toward Williamsport on the Potomac. He had left a pontoon bridge there during his invasion, but a detachment of federal cavalry had found it and destroyed it on July 3rd. So an all-around bad day for the Confederates. And Meade pursues. Lee, of course, is retreating through the gaps in South Mountain, and Meade figures it's kind of fruitless to try and pursue on the direct route. So he sends the 6th Corps under John Sedgwick to prod Lee along. The 6th Corps, of course, had only been marginally engaged at Gettysburg, and so it was in the best shape. The rest of Meade's army moves off to the east to try and get around Lee, but is having to take a longer route because of the rain. The roads are muddy. Of course, both armies have been shot to pieces, and enormous numbers of officers had been lost. Meade had lost 3 corps commanders. He had lost a total of some 300 officers. So his army is not in any better shape than Lee's. Lee gets to the Potomac and finds that all that rain has swollen the river to a flood stage. In some places, it's 1,500 feet wide. And so all the fords have disappeared, and the bridge is gone. So Lee has to turn to face the pursuing Federals. When his engineers begin to tear down houses and stuff to build a makeshift pontoon bridge, but that's going to take a couple of days. The Army of the Potomac shows up, and of course there's a lot of expectation on Meade that's coming from the press, that's coming from the Lincoln administration, to catch and destroy Lee before he can get back over the Potomac into Virginia, where he would have freedom of maneuver again. And with Lee backed up against a flooded river, this seems like an ideal opportunity. In fact, Lincoln believed it was the golden opportunity of the war. And remember that Vicksburg and Port Hudson have just surrendered on July 4th and July 9th. An entire Confederate army has been taken off the board. The Southern Confederacy has been cut in two. And rightly or wrongly, Lincoln believes that if Lee could be destroyed on the north bank of the Potomac, that virtually ends the war. Now, whether that's true or not, it's hard to believe Jeff Davis just throws in the towel, but it's certainly likely that the war changes dramatically and the odds of Confederate victory go down even more dramatically. But Meade, it's going to take a while to get his whole army up. and he's going to be careful, and rightly so. He's shot to pieces. Lee's troops have turned and they've dug in with great speed and great skill. This is really the beginning of the process of the Army's entrenching that you're going to see for the rest of the war. It really kind of starts here because the troops do it. They don't send out engineers and labor troops and stuff to dig these entrenchments. The soldiers turn around, the engineers tell them, dig here, and they build the entrenchments. And so the Confederate position is incredibly strong. And Meade is not just going to precipitously throw his men at earthworks. And so he plans for a Army-wide reconnaissance in force that's supposed to take place on July 13th to probe the Confederate line and see if it had any weak points. Obviously, with its flanks based on a flooded river, the line can't be turned. So he convenes a council of war on the evening of July 12th and finds out that a good percentage of his corps commanders want more time. Halleck is shoving reinforcements toward the Army of the Potomac. The corps commanders don't believe their troops are quite yet ready to make this. And Meade, who has his own concerns about the shape of his army, looks at this situation. He says, you know what, Lee's not going to get away from me. He's backed up against a flooded river. We can take a little bit more time. So he postpones. He sends word of that postponement to Washington, and that goes over like a lead balloon in DC. And Halleck, who's very aware that Lincoln wants Lee destroyed before he can get back over the Potomac, sends Meade this very terse telegram that says, you know, call no councils of war. A council of war never fights. Attack the Confederates at once. Do not let them escape. Well, that response comes too late to do anything on July 13th, but Meade now unquestionably knows what's expected of him. And so he sends his army forward. His skirmishers go forward on the morning of July 14th, but Lee had slipped over the river the night before. His engineers had finished the bridge, and there was a ford that had gotten to a point where you could just barely use it. And so when the Federals go forward, they find a few stragglers in empty trenches. There's a little rear guard action, but the Confederates have gotten away. And when Meade reports that to Washington, that has an even more negative impact than his previous communication. And Halleck, who knows that Lincoln is distraught over this, sends Meade a very, very angry telegram and basically says that, you know, the president is dissatisfied that Lee has gotten away, and you are to pursue him and cut him up wherever he has gone. And let me tell you that it's going to take a very energetic and active pursuit in order to remove the impression that everything you've done heretofore has not been energetic and aggressive. And Meade, who, remember, had only taken command of the Army of the Potomac on June 28th, so just 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg. So he's been in command for about 2 weeks. And his army's been shot to pieces. He fought the biggest, bloodiest battle of the war to date. And he's exhausted. And he's also a man who has a hair-triggered temper. And especially when he's under a great deal of stress, this is how he vents that stress. He lets his temper blow up. And once it blows, he calms down very quickly. But this expression of presidential dissatisfaction really sticks in his craw because he believes he's done everything possible. He did not want to be commander of the Army of the Potomac. He never maneuvered to become commander. He doesn't play politics at all. He believes he's done his best. And he'd taken command against his better judgment and actually had tried to decline and had been told, no, the order's preemptory, you don't get a choice. But now Meade says, look, that's not fair. Dissatisfaction is censure, and I don't deserve to be censured, and you need to put someone else in my place. And of course, there's no way that you can replace Meade at this point in the campaign, and there's no way you can replace the victor of Gettysburg. He's really the only Union commander who can claim to have actually won an unquestionable victory against Robert E. Lee, because McClellan's victory at Antietam was, you know, really kind of just a draw. And so Halleck has to, you know, send a telegram back changing dissatisfaction to disappointment. And saying that, you know, this is not a reason for you to be removed, carry on with your orders. And eventually Lincoln, you know, tries to write a nice mollifying letter in which it morphs as he writes into his anguish, but he never sends that letter. but it's clear to me that they're not particularly happy with them in Washington. And so that's where most histories of the Gettysburg Campaign stop, right there. Lee's over the Potomac. Washington is mad at Meade. Meade is mad at Washington, and bring down the curtain. And I suppose if you've just written a very long book on the Battle of Gettysburg, and you can't really write a short book on the Battle of Gettysburg or the Gettysburg Campaign, you've covered 400, 500, 600, maybe 800 pages. This seems like a good point to ring down the curtain, doesn't it?
Yes, sir.
In fact, we all know that, horrible and momentous things happen in our daily lives, and the next morning the sun comes up and life goes on. We don't click the remote, shut down the TV, and go on to something else. And so the Gettysburg Campaign goes on. Meade has orders to follow Lee and to cut him up, and that is exactly what he's going to try and do. And that's the point really where my book takes up the story.
Excellent. I really appreciate that setup. Before we dig too deep into that, though, you raised a couple points that I think would be really important to dispel for listeners, especially ones who aren't hardcore Civil War nerds. A lot of my viewers are more World War II guys, and women, excuse me. The point I wanted to initially bring up, though, is you talk about 6th Corps being the vanguard of the pursuit initially, and 6th Corps was, pretty much held in reserve, very minimally engaged, if at all. So a lot of folks, if they have a cursory understanding, was like, well, why wasn't 6th Corps, the arm of a counterattack? You've got, if not an overall manpower superiority, although the Union did have one to some degree, you've got more tactical components available. You've got a relatively fresh corps, whereas all 3 corps of the Army of Northern Virginia have been beat up. You've got one that's just been pretty much gutted by having one of its divisions completely wrecked. So why not have 6th Corps launch right into a counterattack? Now there's a lot of great reasons when you look at the time of day, you look at the ground itself, but I was wondering if you could address that a little bit.
Yes. So Pickets Charge, as it's called, takes place very late in the day. So there aren't a lot of hours left afterwards. And remember that for the Federals, the 1st Corps and the 11th Corps had pretty much been wrecked on July 1st. The 3rd Corps had been wrecked on July 2nd. The 12th Corps had been scattered all over the battlefield, trying to help out the Union left flank and then hold on and to his position on the Union right flank, and then retake part of that position that had been lost when troops had been shifted off to the left. The 6th Corps had to march about 30 miles in the July heat to reach the battlefield, so it was exhausted, and then its brigades had been scattered. The Federals had shot off most of their long-range artillery in repulsing the attack on Cemetery Ridge. And the Confederates still had 150 field pieces on the other side of the field along Seminary Ridge. And although they had shut off most of their long-range munitions, they still had lots of canister. And so the only place that Meade could have launched a counterattack would have been to reverse Pickets Charge and go against Seminary Ridge. And he would have faced, in essence, the same problem that Lee had faced, crossing a mile of open ground in the face of massed artillery. You still had Anderson's division on that side of the battlefield, which had only been marginally engaged in the battle. And it takes time. It takes time in the chaos after Pickets Charge, with the 2nd Corps Commander Hancock having just been wounded, to organize these troops and to mass them and send them forward in such a way that they would have a reasonable chance of success. That time wasn't there. And the danger was great. There's more of a question of why Meade doesn't do something on July 4th, but he doesn't have any foresight to know that Lee's done attacking. And Lee still holds positions over in Devil's Den at the face of Little Round Top, and so with the condition of the Union Army, better to wait and let the enemy try to impel himself on you again. And what a lot of people forget is that the Federal position had been taken up by happenstance. It wasn't planned. Meade's supply lines are seriously in disarray. He's got an enormous number of wounded men and now Confederate prisoners to deal with. And his army's been mauled. There's no question that on the first day at Gettysburg, the Federals lose, and lose badly. And on the second day, it is a near run thing. I mean, the Confederates came so close so many times. And arguably, if Pickett's division had been handed on July 2nd to be part of Longstreet's attack, the Confederates probably break the Union line. They came very close as it was. So when you put yourself in Meade's shoes, new to command, having just reached the battlefield on the night of July 1st, with the pummeling his army had taken on the 2nd, are you really going to throw the dice on July 4th? And that close to Washington, with the understanding that if something goes very badly wrong, you might just potentially lose the war.
Yes, sir.
Certainly, you would obliterate, a great deal of the morale advantage that the Federals enjoy by getting control of the Mississippi, which of course Meade doesn't know is happening that very day that Pemberton is surrendering Vicksburg. So one of the things I always try to do in my books is to put myself in the shoes of the men who were there at that moment, and to ignore everything I know about the way the game plays out afterwards. What's the information they had? What does it look like from where they're at that exact spot? And also then to think backwards, because we all deal with our present based on what we've learned in our past and our experiences in the past. So how does, past experience play into your thinking in the now? And, if you are going up against Robert E. Lee, that he surprised the Army of the Potomac on lots of occasions. And so are you just going to discount that audacity at this point? And it's prudent to say no. We've done pretty well receiving the attack and beating it off. Why not play that string out a little bit longer and see if the Confederates will make another mistake like they did on July 3rd?
Yes, sir. Now, which leads me pretty quickly into my second question. We talk about there, once the retreat is commenced and you have the Army of Northern Virginia backed up against the Potomac, and the Corps commanders now requesting more time, Meade Meade believes that's a prudent thing to do. My background, training, inclination at that point, I'm not trying to say I could do any better than George Meade, but never give a defender more time. And I'm wondering whether you believe that might have been a mistake. And perhaps attacking entrenched positions is not always a brilliant idea anyway, but you've got an enemy whose back is up against the water. The more you give him time, he's either going to improve that position or, in this instance, complete his engineering feats in order to be able to evacuate his forces.
So one of the things that we must say about this is a perpetual debate amongst Civil War historians and readers, and you'll never resolve it to anyone's satisfaction. No more than they could resolve it to anyone's satisfaction in 1863. Most of Meade's officers believed that he had done the smart and the right thing. A lot of his troops weren't so sure. They kind of had the sense that, hey, we might finish this thing off, which of course means we get to go home. And everybody acknowledged that the Confederate position was incredibly strong, that it had no weak points. Most of that position is hidden, so you can only see a portion of it from the Federal line. Until you do reconnaissance, you don't actually know the shape of the Confederate position. You don't know where there are points that you should absolutely stay away from and ones that might, be conducive to a successful attack. The other thing is that, if you think about it as, not just what's happening in front of the entrenchments, Halleck is shoving reinforcements toward me. So in a day or two, Meade's going to be even stronger, and he's going to have fresh troops. Now, the caliber of those troops might be a little bit questionable because some of them are hastily raised militia or, parts and pieces of regiments that were still forming or independent companies that have been guarding rail, but still fresh troops, right? And so you're going to get stronger if the enemy isn't. The likelihood of the river going down and the Confederates getting a bridge is suspect. Right. And Meade's also begun to slip his cavalry across the Potomac through Harper's Ferry with orders to get behind the rebel line south of the river, cut off their supplies. So it's not like Meade's just sitting there. So if you consider reinforcements are coming in, we're sending cavalry to get behind Lee south of the river, you're beginning to try something akin to an encirclement. So it's not unreasonable what Meade is doing. And most of his officers believed, and I think reasonably so, that if they had gone forward to attack those entrenchments, they would have been repulsed, and with very heavy losses. Their fear that this might have negated all the advantages won at Gettysburg, I think, is that's not probable. I don't think that Lee would have not retreated over the Potomac if he had repulsed a Federal attack, but it certainly would have put a very sour end to the campaign for the Federals. But here's the one thing that's important as you go forward through my series of books is that Lincoln and Halleck and Stanton, and they're going to forgive me for this, but they're never going to forget it. And everything he does, everything he says, every proposal he makes going forward is going to be viewed by them through the lens of, you let Lee get away without another battle. So even if Meade had attacked and been repulsed with heavy losses, I think, ironically, he would have been in much better stead in the capital than he was, and that would have had an impact on his ability to do what he wanted to do in the next 6 months of the war.
And that's a really important point. I find it very sad that it seems like a commander's reputation or his gravitas is always tied to how many casualties he's taken.
And it happens. When you get to the Mine Run campaign, you know, and there hasn't been a big battle since Gettysburg, and so this is the end of November. Stanton actually tells Meade that it's better for you to go south and fight a battle where you leave 18,000 men on the field with no result than to fight no battle at all. And to Meade, I'm sure that was offensive in both military and human terms, but war is a political, it's a political process as much as it's a military process.
Yes,
right?
sir.
And they had an eye on what the home front needed and wanted. So
it certainly is a tough balance.
The beast. Yeah, it's the nature of the beast.
Yes, sir. So one more point before we move on to the meat of the book, because you laid out what was happening along the Potomac really well. You know, reinforcements are coming. You've got cavalry going through Harper's Ferry to cross the river to, you know, get behind Lee's forces. As you were laying that out, I kept thinking, okay, as a commander, I want to find the enemy, I want to fix them, flank them, and finish them. So we know where they are. We've got cavalry that's going to do that flank. The intent is to finish them. You could maybe argue, I don't think it's a good argument, that because they're up against the river, they're quote unquote fixed, but they could still maneuver across the river, because obviously they did. Were there any demonstrations, any attempts to hold them? You know, maybe not a full-on attack, obviously that didn't take place, but any infantry demonstrations, anything to attempt to fix them, to make them divert their attention?
Yeah, and the answer is no. In fact, the Federals dug in. And so when I say that this is the beginning of, you know, both sides and, you know, here it is, the Confederates are dug in, the Federals are, and some of the Federal officers, you know, the field officers, right, the regimental commanders, and wondered about that. It's like, why are we digging in? That surely the Confederates are not going to attack us. And they were really afraid that digging in would dull the aggressive instinct of their troops, which is, you know, after a big bloodletting, that's very realistic. Everybody has very fresh in their mind what can happen on the battlefield to you personally and to your unit. And so anything that might suggest that we should be taking pains to protect ourselves rather than thinking about going at the enemy might not psychologically be conducive toward launching an attack. I think that was probably overblown, that the Federal troops would have gone forward and with vigor. They really did seem to understand that here was the opportunity. One of them writes, you know, we'd have probably lost 10,000 men in attacking Lee's fortifications, but given the probable impact on the outcome of the war, the private soldier thought it was worth trying. And that's compelling because they would be the guys doing it. But then the federal officers looked at it and agreed, yes, we'd probably lose 10,000 men and it might fail. And in that instance, it's not worth it because we're going to need those 10,000 men later for what's going to come. And again, that's the thing. We tend to look at campaigns and so here's a book on a campaign that has a beginning and has an end. And so we're just kind of looking at this subset of the war. Those guys are having to think about the war's going to go on. And it's going to go on and it's going to go on. And God knows when it's going to end. Meade is also conscious of the draft riots in Washington, or rather in New York, that are taking place even as he's sitting there on the Potomac. There's a lot of unrest, and Meade is not a believer in the draft. He doesn't think it's going to bring forward enough men, and he doesn't think it's going to bring forward the right kind of men, because a soldier who's forced to fight is not going to fight with the valor and the vigor he believes that will be necessary. Every battle has been bigger, every battle has been bloodier, and your 2-year enlistments had expired and most of those men had gone home. And in the spring, the 3-year enlistments are going to expire. And why would you think most of those men are not going to go home? And so Meade's looking at this and he perceives that the North is beginning to have as bad a manpower problem as the Confederacy. And it doesn't matter how big your population is, if you can't put soldiers in uniform and get them into the field, if they're not willing to fight and run the risk necessary to win, then you've got a bad problem. And in circumstances like that, fighting for the sake of fighting, suffering needless casualties that gain you nothing, is a recipe for long-term failure in search of short-term and doubtful success.
Gotcha, sir. And again, a fantastic summation. I appreciate the detailed answer. I feel like we're in the podcast version of Coddington here. We've been going for like a half an hour and we haven't even gotten into what we really want to talk about. So let's do that now. Lee's across the river. Meade has been admonished. His ire's up, but he's pursuing now. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about the next couple weeks.
Yeah, I'm gonna throw a map here onto the screen. So Lee has retreated over the Potomac at Williamsport, but he doesn't go very far to the south. He puts his infantry on the Winchester Pike around Darksville and Bunker Hill. He leads Stuart's cavalry closer to the river around Leetown, but of course the Confederate cavalry sort of spread out in a big arc here. And he would like to linger near the Potomac to see what Meade is going to do, because we're not very far away from the Antietam battlefield. And when Lee had retreated after that, McClellan didn't move for 6 weeks. Maybe Meade won't move for 6 weeks. And Lee's not inclined to give up more Virginia than is required, but he also needs to give all of the captured supplies, the long wagon train full of wounded, the 26,000 sheep, the 25,000 head of cattle, the 4,500 prisoners he's captured. Those need to go south, up the valley to clear the area and give his army the roads if it needs to maneuver. So Lee's hanging around down here. At the same time, there's a federal force of 6,000 men under the command of Brigadier General Benjamin Kelly, who's been gathered to the west of Williamsport. These are troops that have been guarding the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad for most of the war, but they've been pulled together under Kelly to reinforce Meade. So there's a Union threat that's developing, not a big one, mind you, but not an insubstantial one, up to the west. Meade has sent Gregg's cavalry division, or at least 2 of its brigades, across the river on July 14th with the mission of cutting the Confederate supply lines. And so Gregg gets over the river, the Federals reoccupy Harper's Ferry. Gregg doesn't know, of course, that Lee has retreated. So on the 15th, he goes toward Charlestown to see if he can get Lee's supply line. He's rebuffed there. So he turns around and he moves north toward Shepherdstown. Here Stuart's going to attack him and basically drive him back into Harper's Ferry before he even knows that Lee's infantry is on this side of the river. Yeah, while all of that's happening, Meade is shifting down toward Harper's Ferry and Berlin, intent on following his orders to cross the river. And he's not happy about this, by the way. He writes his wife, Margaret, who's a very politically savvy lady, the daughter of a congressman or a former congressman, and she's a real confidant to Meade. And he basically writes her and he says, you know, they're asking me to do something that's impossible, and that is to pursue and destroy Lee now that he's got freedom of maneuver below the river. I'm probably not going to be able to do that. The administration should be content to drive Meade out of Maryland and let him alone, and this army should not cross the river until it has been reinforced and largely reorganized and put in such a condition that it's sure to gain a success. But he knows that politically that's a no-go. He's got to cross the river. And so when he crosses the river, he's going to cross into the Loudoun Valley. And that's strategically a brilliant move because it's going to put him on the eastern flank of the rebel army in the Shenandoah. And so here is the Blue Ridge Mountains. There's the Shenandoah River, which of course has two forks that flow together, a north and a south fork to make the actual river, which then flows into the Potomac at Harper's Ferry. And this river is as flooded as the Potomac. And the Blue Ridge Mountains here divide the Shenandoah Valley from the Loudoun Valley. And therefore the gaps in those mountains become key because big picture, what Lee is going to need to do is to get his army through those gaps back into central Virginia. He's going to wind up in Culpeper County. So he's in a blocking position between Washington and Richmond again. Meade's goal is to get into the Loudoun Valley and then push his army through these gaps, get into the Shenandoah south of Lee, and try and trap him, in essence, against the south bank of the Potomac River. Cut him off from supplying reinforcement, force him into a big fight in the upper valley. It's called upper because, the lower valley, because it's even though it's north on the map, the terrain is going down toward the Potomac, right? And there's no real good defensive terrain here. And so if you can force him into a fight here, you've got a good chance of at least wrecking most of the Army of Northern Virginia. And so this is Meade's big picture idea. It's going to take him a while to get over the river. It's a real challenge for his engineers to build a bridge at Berlin because the river's 1,500 feet wide. And one of the fun things here is Gouverneur Warren is still the Army's chief engineer. And so he sends a telegram to Washington. He says, we're going to need more pontoon boats to bridge the Potomac. So please send them, but send them by rail. Don't send them by the B&O Canal because the Confederates have wrecked the canal. There's long stretches that have no water in it. And somehow only part of that message registers in Washington. So they send the boats, but they send them by canal. And so this would have actually cost Meade a day or two in getting over the river. But as the federal engineers begin to bridge it, of course, the current's very strong and there's all this flotsam and jetsam, coming downstream that is threatening their bridge building activity. So they have to send a couple companies to stop that stuff and collect it. And what they realize they're collecting is the remnants of the makeshift bridge that Lee's engineers had built at Williamsport, because they destroyed that after they left. And so that's all raging downstream. And the federal engineers gather that up and being, good, ingenuitive Yankees, they go, oh, well, we'll use this to finish our bridge. And on the day that they finish the bridge, then the extra pontoon boats finally show up. And so they're able to put two bridges over the river, and Meade is able to get himself down into the Loudoun Valley. And these white lines here are the forward progress of his infantry on the various days. So he moves fairly slowly at first, and then he picks up speed as he goes along. And one of the interesting things that happens here is that neither Lee nor Meade knows much about what's going on the other side of those mountains. And so there's a real intelligence vacuum for both sides as they're beginning to engage in this chess match that's essentially going to go on for 10 days.
What's the cavalry situation at this point? Because I imagine those are the guys who are fighting for the intel and are trying to, I'm assuming, try to control the gaps.
So the interesting thing is that because the Shenandoah is flooded, Stuart cannot get reinforcements into the small detachments he'd left in these gaps when Lee invaded Pennsylvania. So these are essentially company-sized detachments. They were mostly men who didn't have horses and so couldn't ride into Pennsylvania. And so as the Federals come down, they have a lot more cavalry here. And so the cavalry is moving in front of the infantry with the job of seizing these gaps. So they get Snickers Gap on the 18th. They get Ashby's Gap on the 20th in just very small skirmishes. And this gives me the ability to put observers up here on the mountains. The Confederates can't do much about it because the river's flooded. But these observers aren't helpful because, well, there's clouds in the valley, so you can't really see down there. And when you can finally see, what the Federals are going to notice is that there are a lot of Confederate troops around Winchester, and there's still Confederate troops up here around Bunker Hill. Some deserters come in to Federal units in Maryland, and that message is sent to Meade by courier, because when he crosses the river, he loses all telegraph communication with the North, and he loses his supply line with the North. So he's only got the food that he's carrying with him. And so that message is going to come to Meade, and suddenly Meade's like, Lee's still here. Why is Lee here? This is not a smart thing for Lee to do. I expect that he would be scurrying south up the valley to get through those mountain passes and back into central Virginia as quickly as he can. And so this puzzles me. And then it becomes a great concern for a couple of reasons. One, he gets captured Confederate newspapers that say that massive reinforcements are on their way to Lee from Tennessee and from the Carolinas. Now, that's not true. Lee's only going to get a single brigade, and that's one of the brigades from Pickett's division that had been left in central Virginia to guard the railroads, and was ordered to him on July 9th and will reach him on the 13th at Winchester. But it would be a logical thing for the Confederates to do, right? To send reinforcements to an army that's just lost a battle. So it's not beyond the realm of theoretical possibility. But of course, if you're also paying attention to the fact that Vicksburg just fallen, that Port Hudson has just fallen, that Rosecrans is pushing Bragg back on Knoxville, that Charleston, South Carolina is under heavy siege, where are those Confederate reinforcements going to come from? And Halleck sends a message to Meade and basically tells him, you don't have anything to fear. Not a man is going to reinforce Lee, and your army is much bigger than his. And it's not hugely bigger, but it's bigger. And it can be reinforced, whereas Lee can't. And so, you should be aggressive. The difficulty for Meade is he's not sure that Halleck knows what he's talking about. And the fact that the Confederates are hovering here, and then a couple of other things are going to happen. The Federal force under Kelly is going to cross the Potomac and move to Hedgesville in the western reaches of the valley. And he's got orders from Halleck to find the enemy and try and do some damage. Well, with 6,000 men, Kelly's kind of cautious. He doesn't want to poke the beehive and have the Army of Northern Virginia come down on him. But nonetheless, he makes a push toward Martinsburg on July 19th. The Confederates meet it and drive him back. It's just a small skirmish. But now suddenly you have the Confederates acting very aggressively up here. And that just sort of validates for Meade that Lee is waiting for these reinforcements, and then he's going to take the offensive. He's going to resume the offensive either by crossing the Potomac, or more fearfully for Meade, he might plunge through one of these gaps and get in Meade's rear in the Loudon Valley. So the deeper into this valley Meade goes, the greater the void behind him that Lee might plunge into. And if he gets here, then he's the one who cuts Meade off from supply and reinforcement, and the Union Army suddenly is the one that's in great danger. And as a consequence of that, Meade is going to stop the southward movement of his infantry on July 20th for 35 critical hours. And so the Union cavalry is going to go south to try and get into Manassas and Chester's Gap and block those exit for the Confederacy. But from July 21st, Lee has already begun to move his army down through these gaps. Longstreet's corps going first, and then followed by Hill's, and then followed by Ewell's, which had spent July 22nd in a daring maneuver, really, to try and surround and destroy Kelly's force. That maneuver went belly up when some Unionists found out about the Confederate plan and got word to Kelly. And he retreated over the Potomac. But again, another thrust toward the river that would give Meade reason to believe that his fears of Confederates being reinforced and resuming the offensive were justifiable.
Oh, yes, sir. So the thing that I'm thinking about there is on the one hand, you got to worry about what the enemy can do, not what you think they're going to do. So I understand why Meade is concerned about securing his rear, worried about a renewed offensive, but at the same time to pause for 35 hours, the mantra that speed kills just keeps coming through my head. And the idea that a commander is going to give up that speed, you don't want to get into what if history, but if that was 35 hours worth of maneuver, I think that could have been fruitfully spent.
Yeah, if the Union, because what's going to happen is the Union cavalry gets down into these gaps, and then Meade tries to order it onto Front Royal, which is a critical spot because it sits at the western exit of both Manassas and Chester's Gap. And Chester's Gap is the one that Lee wants to use. If there had been infantry to back up this cavalry, they might have done it and at least trapped Ewell and Hill's corps in the lower valley, although Longstreet's already kind of on his way through. So the lack of infantry is going to void that possibility. And certainly you can contrast this with Grant, who famously, said, "I never worried about what the enemy did out of my sight." And in the Wilderness has that, wonderful quote where he tells the Army of the Potomac's generals, "You need to stop worrying about what Lee's going to do and start thinking about what we are going to do to Lee." Certainly a general like Grant would probably not have paused his infantry, but remember, Meade is still in a very difficult situation. He really doesn't know much about what's happening over here. There are, of course, the possibility there can be a lot of Confederates down here in central Virginia. He is working with a shot-up army. He doesn't have much faith in most of his corps commanders because his best ones had been killed or wounded at Gettysburg. Command and control here is, difficult, and there's no telegraph lines, whatsoever for him to work with. And so he's being exceptionally prudent. And I think it's easier to criticize him for his caution here in the Loudoun Valley than it is to criticize him for a caution at Williamsport. Lee didn't know anything more about what was going on in the Loudoun Valley than Meade knew about what was going on in the Shenandoah Valley. But Lee, with that dearth of information, was not frozen. He said, "What would be the most dangerous thing the enemy can do to me?" And it would be to push his army through these passes and cut me off in the valley. And having decided this is the most dangerous thing the enemy can do, Lee said, then that's what he's going to do. And I need to move to counter that. One of the interesting things about this is that the Federals are going to have conflicting information coming in about, hey, the Confederates are going this way, but they're also going this way. What's actually happening. So these observation points in the mountains were kind of sending mixed signals, and also the information they're getting from north of the Potomac about what Ewell's doing here is also sending mixed signals. And as a consequence of all of this, Ewell's thrust comes to nothing, but it leaves Early's division up here at Hedgesville, whereas Rhodes and Johnson's divisions are back down here at Darksville. And so there's about 10 miles between Early and the rest of the Second Corps. And when the Federals do get some visibility here, they misconstrue what they're seeing. So as Ewell's two divisions under Johnson and Rhodes begin to move toward Chester's Gap, the Federal observers think that that's the entire Second Corps. And they've misidentified Early's division, which had been part of that effort to destroy Kelly, as A.P. Hill's troops. And so they think Early's division way up here is Hill's entire corps. And these two divisions down here moving toward Chester's Gap are Ewell's corps, and that only Longstreet is getting through the gaps. So when Meade figures out that there is no Confederate offensive and frees his infantry, he pushes most of his troops toward Manassas Gap, which is the first place where he could fight his way through the front royal. And he believes if he can get there, he's going to trap 2/3 of the Army of Northern Virginia here. But so he's going to wind up sending 3 corps here. He's going to leave the 6th Corps and his reserve artillery, though, in the middle in case Longstreet were to turn up and attack this way. And he's also got to extend the 11th Corps and some of his cavalry and the 1st Corps toward Warrenton because he's running out of food. And he's having to send orders to his commanders to make your rations last at least 1/3 longer than the period for which they were issued, because the Army concentrated and with no supply line to speak of, we're going to eat through our food very quickly. If we could break into the valley, we might be able to live off the land as long as we're moving, but until we can do that, there's a real supply crunch in terms of foodstuffs that is bearing down on Meade.
Yes, sir. So that takes us through to the 22nd at that point where they force Manassas Gap.
Yeah, so what's going to happen here is that Confederate forces on July 21st made a very important stand in Manassas Gap. On July 22nd, the Confederates maneuvered a Federal Cavalry Brigade away from the exit to Chester's Gap, and so then they start to flow through. But on the 23rd, the Federals begin to push through Manassas Gap, and when they get the 3rd Corps up there, there's a single Confederate brigade in their path, Wright's Georgia Brigade, which only had about 600 men left after Gettysburg. But the commander of the 3rd Corps is brand new to Corps Command, General William F. French. He spent most of the war as a division commander in the 2nd Corps, had been transferred from there to take command of the garrison at Harper's Ferry just before the Gettysburg Campaign really gets going. And he had brought the Harper's Ferry troops over in division strength to reinforce Meade after Gettysburg. And Meade assigned French to the 3rd Corps, which had been mauled. And by virtue of seniority, French is the 2nd highest ranking major general in the Army at that point. He gets command of the 3rd Corps. French gets a lot of bad press. He's not certainly one of the great Union generals, but he had seen a very tough fighting in the war. He had been in command of Federal artillery at Eagle Pass in Texas when the whole secession thing broke out, and he refused to surrender his command to the Texans and marched them 300 miles down the Rio Grande and got them on a boat and took them to Key West to avoid surrender. And that's pretty gritty stuff. And he had commanded an infantry brigade in the Peninsula Campaign, done well enough there to get a division command. But as a division commander, here's the fun resume that he gets. He gets to attack the Sunken Road at Antietam. He gets to attack the Stone Wall at Fredericksburg, and then he gets to try and stop Stonewall Jackson after he routed the 11th Corps at Chancellorsville. The man has learned caution, and I think reasonably so. And so as he goes into this gap with these steep sides, it's almost as though he'd seen too many of those 1950s Westerns, where the cavalry rides into the canyon, the Indians suddenly show up on the mountains on either flank of him. He's really worried about the Confederates luring him into a trap. And so he spends a lot of time deploying troops to guard against that. And when he finally pushes forward, he does so basically with only a division-sized skirmish line. And he does drive the Confederates backward over time. There's a very gallant assault by the Excelsior Brigade on Wright's Georgians, these 600 guys who lose a quarter of their strength in that day's fighting, but delayed the Federals long enough for Rhodes' division to reach the field and Johnston's division to be right behind it and to block the exit to Manassas Gap. And so the Federal thrust through here is stopped on the 23rd. And what that means is that Meade has not quite been able to do what he wants, but he thinks he's in a position to do it because his observers are still seen early coming down the valley toward Winchester. And remember, they think that's Hill's entire corps. They know they've got Ewell in front of them, and they've also seen a battery of Confederate artillery turn around from Chester's Gap and head back to Front Royal. Now, in reality, this is Stuart's horse artillery that just got tired of waiting for this long log jam of troops and wagons, this giant traffic jam. And they said, no, we're gonna take a quicker way out of here. But over the last few days, Meade had captured prisoners in Manassas Gap from all three rebel corps. And so he thinks that he's forced Lee to turn around and make a big fight here, when in fact, Lee is getting all of his men, through Chester's Gap, just a few miles to the south, basically barely out of sight. And so that evening, Meade orders the reinforcements in. So he's already brought the 5th Corps in behind the 3rd. Now he brings the 2nd Corps in. He tells the 12th Corps to march close to the entrance to the Manassas Gap. So he masses overnight 35,000 troops around the little village of Linden, which is at the apex of Manassas Gap. There were so many men crammed into this space with so little room that they actually had to sleep sitting up. There wasn't enough room for everybody to lay down. But that evening, Ewell pulled Rhodes and Johnson's out of Manassas Gap, and then he's going to march down the Lorry Valley and be on his way south. Hill and Longstreet have gotten through Chester's Gap already. Early's going to divert towards Strasburg so he can take a gap further south. And when Meade begins to push forward on the morning of the 24th, again, the rebels are gone. And
that 35-hour delay just keeps resonating in my head.
35-hour delay made a big difference. If he had had infantry to back up his cavalry here, he would have probably wound up fighting Longstreet and Hill. So he would have gotten the big battle that he wanted. Would it have turned out to be a Union victory or not is a very open question. But certainly that 35-hour delay had an enormous impact on Meade. And so it highlights the critical role of intelligence in military operations. Meade was receiving conflicting information. He made a wrong interpretation about what his enemy was doing on the basis of that information, and it led him to delay. And it wasn't a horribly long delay, but this is something we see over and over again with Meade. He'll delay for 8 hours, 12 hours, 20 hours, not really a long period of time, but against an opponent like Robert E. Lee, you don't give him that kind of advantage because he's going to make maximum use of it, as we see happen here. And so by the latter part of July, Lee's army is back in Culpeper and Madison County. It's got the upper Rappahannock River between it and the Federals. And after the failure at Manassas Gap, Meade is forced to pivot his whole army and march rapidly to Warrenton because they're out of food. He's got to reconnect with the Orange and Alexandria Railroad so that he can resupply his army, which is done within just a couple of days. The Confederates had to envy that everything that your army needed could be resupplied in just 2 days. Yes, but before Meade can then continue to pursuit, the draft has been suspended in the North. Halleck sends word that I'm going to have to start pulling regiments from you to, cow the protesters so we can resume the draft. I want you to pull up on the upper Rappahannock because we can't give you reinforcements. I don't want you to go get into a big battle. And so that's going to give both armies 6 weeks to recover from the Gettysburg Campaign. And they'll recover very quickly. By the beginning of September, both the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac have the same strength they did on July 1st of 1863.
That's amazing when you think that they fought that incredible battle.
This is common. Within a couple of months at worst, these armies recover, and a lot of men who had been sick or were convalescing from wounds return. You get some new recruits and some conscripts and that sort of thing. And essentially what happens south of the Potomac just reinforces the fact that the North did not pick the fruits of its Gettysburg victory. That Lee managed to execute a successful retreat and did it with skill and talent. And I'm sure you've heard the old axiom that you can't be a really great general unless you've had to conduct a difficult retreat.
Yes, sir.
And Lee had done that. And so at the end of July, the beginning of August, the two armies are basically in the same spot they had been after the Antietam campaign in October of 1862. They're in the same spot. They're essentially where they were at the start of the Gettysburg campaign. And what has changed in Virginia? And the answer is not much. Strategically, it's the same story. And so I think this bears on the question of, is Gettysburg anything like the turning point of the war? Because the war looks a lot like it did after Gettysburg as it did before. Certainly it's impactful, better for the Federals that they won than that they lost. But in terms of what's going on in Virginia, it's one more big bloody battle that produces no real strategic result except a negative strategic result, right? So then we say the same thing about Chancellorsville. What if Hooker had won? Fredericksburg, what if Burnside had won? Second Manassas, what if Pope had won? The 7 days, what if McClellan had won? Then wouldn't everything be different? Of course. But isn't that the same as saying, well, what if Lee had won at Gettysburg? Everything would have been different, right? But if you look at what actually happens, it's the continued stalemate, and continued stalemate is something of the South's friend. If you believe that the wars come to the point where you're just trying to hold the Federals off and wear them down, so Lincoln loses re-election in November of '64, then stalemate is the Confederacy's friend. And Lee managed to maintain that stalemate in Virginia. The South isn't doing so well west of the Appalachians, but in Virginia, Gettysburg just takes us back to our starting point, like every previous battle had taken you back to your starting point.
When they talk about the ubiquitous Gettysburg being a turning point, what I always consider, as I've started to learn a little bit, is, as you stated, if I'm of the personal opinion that Northern morale could not have sustained a victory by Lee. I don't think the Union could win the war at Gettysburg, obviously, because they didn't even though they won the battle. I'm not so sure they wouldn't have lost if the Army of the Potomac had been destroyed.
Well, there are a couple of things here. And one is that even if Lee wins at Gettysburg, Vicksburg and Port Hudson still surrender. And the North gets the enormous victory of opening the Mississippi, which was very important to the upper Northwest and the Midwest. So victories in the West had always offset Confederate victories in Virginia. Okay. Northern morale, I think, was tougher than most people suppose. The North had kind of been drifting toward, is this all worth it? Before Lee invaded Pennsylvania. And this is one of the reasons that some Confederates argued against doing this, is you're going to rouse the Northern people. Suddenly they're defending their homes, which is very different than we're continuing to try and invade somebody else's home and getting nowhere with it and suffering all these horrible casualties and that sort of thing. Unless Lee were to actually destroy the Army of the Potomac. And that's not something that really happened in Civil War battles unless armies were trapped and surrounded, at least not until the very end in '65, where the odds become so lopsided it was possible to substantially destroy an army. So let's assume that Lee wins on July 2nd. He breaks the Union line. Meade retreats toward the defenses of Washington, which are impregnable. Then what does Lee do? Halleck is still gathering reinforcements from everywhere. All of those troops that had been used to force Vicksburg into surrender are now free and can be put on boats and trains and shipped rapidly to the east, right? Lee certainly is no condition to stay in Pennsylvania. So this, in essence, is a giant raid, very helpful to him. Would this provoke foreign intervention? Probably not, coupled with what happens on the Mississippi. And so at some point, Lee has to go back to Virginia anyway. He benefits from this logistically. The South certainly has something to counterbalance the loss of the Mississippi, but it's really hard to see how Confederate victory at Gettysburg collapses the Union war effort. Lincoln is no more prone to give up than Jeff Davis. So politically, it might have mattered in the elections that are going to happen in October or November. And this is what Lincoln's Secretary John Hay says: if we'd lost at Gettysburg, the war wouldn't have ended, the war would have kept going, but we would have had a much harder time because the Democrats would have benefited from it. There would be more anti-war people in Congress, and maybe more anti-war or doubtful war, might be a better way to put it, governors in northern states. And so everything going forward would have been harder. It would have been harder.
Do you think it would have been harder to the point where it would have been impossible?
Well, again,
as you indicated, the war is political at its highest level. So if you've got a Copperhead Congress and more Democratic governors, can you bring reinforcements forward anymore? Can you enact meaningful legislation that allows you to, perpetuate the war?
Remember, the volunteering has dried up. You've turned to the draft. And so maybe there's more resistance to the draft, but then the Union also has this trump card of enlisting coloreds. And so free blacks in the North, runaway slaves in the South. And this is the period when they're making their first real debut in combat at Milliken's Bend out in Louisiana, at Fort Wagner with the 54th Massachusetts and that kind of thing. So this is a vast reserve of manpower that the North can draw on, regardless of what kind of opposition they're getting politically. So everything gets harder. But now you've got Grant's and Banks' armies that are freed on the Mississippi to go where they want. Certainly, this is not going to have an impact on Rosecrans, who's going to be able to maneuver Bragg out of Chattanooga. So I just don't see it. I no more than I believe that if Lee's army had been substantially destroyed at Williamsburg, the Confederacy says, "Oh, that's it, we're done." I don't believe if the Army of the Potomac had been wrecked and it was wrecked at Gettysburg, okay, that Lincoln would have thrown in the towel. The way that things go forward would have been different, but a Confederate victory at Vicksburg or at Gettysburg is counterbalanced by the Confederate defeat at Vicksburg, which takes a whole army off the map.
Gotcha, sir. Well, I really appreciate that analysis. That's fantastic. So we've basically come to the end of the campaign. As you'd indicated earlier, the 1st of August is the official end of the campaign, but everyone's pretty much settling into their final positions, their 1862 positions by the end of the month. Is there anything you want to wrap up the discussion of the maneuver with? Sure.
I mean, one of the things that we have to recognize is that we're not done. There is going to be a great deal that happens in August and September and October and November. The cavalry is going to fight in the period of just 7 weeks, 3 major engagements in August and September of 1863. And it's during this period, of course, that the Battle of Chattanooga or Chickamauga happens. That's going to lead the Confederates to send Longstreet west. And then, the transfer of the 11th and 12th Corps and Longstreet are going to have an impact on things in Virginia. Lee's going to go on to the offensive and drive Meade back on Washington. It's going to produce a lot of minor fighting, but no big battle. Then Meade's going to go on to the offensive as well. And so there's a lot of back and forth and a lot of important strategic stuff that's going to happen that is going to have an enormous impact on the war going forward and set the stage for the 1864 campaigns. So one of the things about this period between July 13th and December 31st, 1863 is that those 6 months in Virginia that are generally ignored by historians are incredibly important. Not only is there a lot of maneuvering and a lot of fighting, but a lot of the strategic decisions that are made, the outcomes of all this maneuvering and fighting literally set the stage for what's going to go forward. They're the bridge between Gettysburg and Vicksburg, as it turns out, and the Overland Campaign and Sherman's drive for Atlanta. You can't get to that without going through these 6 months of connective tissue. And so that's why I'm writing a series of books about it, because there is so much of such great importance that takes place during that period of time.
Now, is that so? again, so the book, Meade and Lee after Gettysburg, this is obviously the first in the series.
Yes.
And what are the other titles? What's the scope of the series?
So the scope of the series looks at the entire period from July 13th until you get to December of 1863. So I'm looking at everything that happens in Virginia during that time period. So there'll be 4 books in the series. These are the 3 that have been published thus far. So Meade and Lee after Gettysburg looks at that 10-day span when the armies are dueling on either side of the Blue Ridge. Then Meade and Lee at Bristow Station covers August, September, and October of 63. And then Meade and Lee at Rappahannock Station is Meade's first real offensive action that takes place at the beginning of November of 1863. And then there will be the Mine Run campaign, Meade and Lee at Mine Run, which will be the last book in the series.
And are you working on the Mine Run volume right now?
Yes, it's substantially written, but it's being tweaked, improved, reinforced in places. One of the things about writing a book is that it leads to more questions as you go through the process. So you get to a point, and this especially happens to me when I'm drawing maps. It's like, okay, I know where all of these units are, and I'm putting on the map on, but wait, where's this unit? And then it's more research. Where were even if they're not one of the active components for that map, I still need to know where they're at. And that's not always as easy to do as one might think, because the after action reports and the official records are not always as illustrative as one would like. And so it's like, where was the First Corps? Well, Newton, who's commanding the First Corps, doesn't tell me where it is on this day and that day. So you have to go through the diaries and the letters of the men in his command, hoping that one of them will mention where they are.
Which has got to be fascinating, but also tedious.
Yeah, it is. But research is fun. And you get into this because you have questions that you want to answer. And that's the only way that you're going to answer them is to dig it up for yourself. And then you get to, if you're going to write, you get to share it with people. But certainly, you learn a lot of things that you didn't expect to learn. And if you're doing it right, you let the evidence take you to the conclusion. You don't start with the conclusion and then go find the evidence to support what you want to say.
Yes, sir. That's fantastic. Well, please keep this slide up because I want the viewers to be able to get a good look at these titles here. But so, folks, my guest today has been Jeffrey Hunt. He is educated at the University of Texas Austin, both bachelor's and master's degree. He's got a amazing career in public history as the curator of collections at the Admiral Nimitz Museum of the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, for a while. He's currently working at the I don't want to mess it up. The Texas
Military Forces Museum. I'm the
director. There we go. The
Texas
Texas Military Forces Museum, which is down at Texas Joint Forces Headquarters at Camp Mabry in Austin, Texas. I can't think of a better guy by inclination, training, and education to write this series of books. I appreciate you coming out and spending time with us today. I know I learned a lot, and I want to take the opportunity to invite you back to discuss other volumes in the series at your convenience, Jeff.
I'd love to do that.
All right, terrific. Well, thank you for joining us today, sir, and have a great day.
You too.